Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Dealing with grief is often an impetus to going on a big journey. Subconsciously, I think we realize we need time to process and reflect, and getting away, going to a remote place gives us that time. Today, we're talking to Patrick Davies, author of Where Skylarks Sing, a book about his walk across England from Land's End in Cornwall to John O'Groats in northern Scotland. Hi, Patrick. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
I am really interested about your book and your journey. It's a very classic English walk. You've made it a little bit different, but before we get into that, I'm really interested. You did your walk in 2021. Why did you decide to walk across Britain?
Well, it's a sort of good question. The original impetus for the idea were a couple of friends, actually, who I eventually, sometime in early 2021, managed to go and visit after sort of all the COVID lockdowns that we were all experiencing around the world. And I was sort of wondering what I should be doing next, having been a British diplomat for 25 years and then having written a book about the US, which was my last posting, and then ending up in COVID, sort of helping to look after my dad who had Alzheimer's. I was in sort of one of those places where do I go from here? And these friends said, "Oh, you should walk across the country." It was just a bizarre sort of suggestion, really. I mean, I do walk, but I've always liked the outdoors, but I've never done anything long distance before. And they said, "Oh, it'd be great. You'll have time to think and you'll having spent quite a lot of my working life abroad, you'll be able to sort of get back in touch with the country and sort of get to know it a bit better." And so that's where the original idea came from. And to be honest, to start with, I thought it was a bit crazy. I was like, why would I do that? That's a very long way. It would take quite some time. So I wasn't entirely convinced, but then I sort of went back home, and the more I thought about it, the more sort of it grew in appeal, and I started, looking at books about people who've done long distance walks, and started just sort of subconsciously to thinking this would be a great thing to do. It would also give me time to think about what I wanted to do next, and as you say, come to terms with the grief over my dad's condition. And what's weird about Alzheimer's, and I'm sure many of your listeners have family members who or have suffered from this, or partners and so on, is that you sort of lose the person before they die, really. I mean, that sounds a strange thing to say, but, as Alzheimer's or dementia takes its hold on people, their characters change, their ability to communicate change. And so you sort of start to grieve for, in my case, my dad, while he's still here, and that's sort of quite hard to process. So I put all that together and just thought, this is a great thing to go and do and have that time to process and think. And so before I knew it, only about 3 weeks after the suggestion was made, with quite very little preparation, I thought, I'm going. The friends made the suggestion in June sometime, and I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to do it in the summer. I don't want to do it in the winter. So I better get going. So about 3 weeks later, in the middle of July, I was in the far southwest of Britain and set off.
And so, you were dealing with giving up a career that I can imagine being a diplomat. You have a whole bunch of other people away from country kind of living together. You form really, really tight bonds in a way that we probably don't do in regular businesses. But you'd left that career, and then you'd also been a carer for your father and helping your mother. It must have been really, really tough to make the decision to, I'm going to go walk and leave all of this. And leaving your career must have caused grief and the uncertainty, and then leaving your mom to support your dad. How hard was that? Because reading your book, it seems that was a really, really the drive down, it was a really, really tough decision.
Yeah, it was. And I sort of got quite frustrated with myself, really, because I sort of hesitated from sort of announcing to my parents, to my mum in particular, that I was heading off. I was going to do this walk because I felt really guilty to be leaving her behind. And so what had happened is when I came back from my last posting in the US, I was based in London to start with, because obviously that's where our government is based, and so that's where I'd been living when I was in the UK. And then just before COVID hit, I actually came up to my parents, who were in the north of England, and I took my parents away. We went to the west of Wales, Pembrokeshire, beautiful coastal area of Wales, for a few days, just to give my mum a bit of a break and take them away from home, which is quite difficult with somebody with dementia. And while we were there, the sort of lockdown got tougher and tougher until the day we got back. Our Prime Minister stood up and said, right, nobody goes anywhere. We're in full lockdown now. And my mum turned to me that evening and said, I'm not sure I can do this on my own if you go back to London. And anyway, why would you want to go back to London and be in a city in the middle of a pandemic? So I agreed to stay. We thought it would just be a few weeks, to be honest. I think we all did. We were that optimistic. And more than a year later, I was still there because, over that period, 2020, 2021, the lockdowns had eased at times. But then when they eased, the virus got out of control and then there was more lockdowns again. So I never escaped. So I'd been there a year by this point, and so I felt really bad. I felt that, I was leaving my mum in a difficult situation. And actually, she was, when eventually, you'd think a man of my age should be able to have those conversations quite easily with her parents. But it was harder than I thought. And then my mum was brilliant. She was just like, that's fantastic. Go, do it. And my dad, he was like, I'm coming with you. He was like, not sure that's going to work, unfortunately. Because they've always loved the outdoors as well and gone hiking and stuff and camping and so on. So yeah, it was a tough one. But then once it was out there, they were so supportive all the way through. So that was great.
I mentioned your journey, often called Le Jog, Land's End to John O'Groats. Really famous, but a lot of people probably don't know what it is. Can you maybe just talk about big picture? How long is it? What are some of the, great places it goes through? And, how long were you planning on spending doing the walk?
So Land's End to John O'Groats, it's a little bit arbitrary, really. So Land's End is in the far southwest of England, in Cornwall, and John O'Groats is in the far northeast of Scotland. So they are the two places in Great Britain that are the furthest apart. They're nothing more than that. So it's become a bit of a thing. I guess it's a little bit of, it's Britain's Pacific Crest Trail in a way. It's the long distance hike in the UK, and in fact, it's more for lots of people do it on a bike rather than
That's where I've always heard it is on the bike, and I was so interested in your walking it because I haven't heard much of people doing it that way.
Fewer people walk it, why it's a little bit different to sort of some other famous long distance trails is because it isn't a single path. There isn't a single defined route to walk it or even to cycle it. People make up their own routes. And by adding together national trails, and then there's bits when actually there aren't national long distance trails and you have to sort of put other footpaths together to make your route. So if you went the most direct route between Land's End and John O'Groats, it's about 800 miles, something like that. So obviously considerably shorter than something like the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail. But the route I took, you mentioned this earlier, that I did a bit of a variation of it. I was like, well, Land's End to John O'Groats is a bit arbitrary and, lots of people do that. So I want to do something a bit different. So I started about 2 or 3 days to the east of Land's End, still in the far southwest of England, in a place called Lizard Point, which is a stunningly beautiful peninsula that juts out into the Atlantic, and that's the southernmost point on the mainland. And then I decided my end point would be the most northern point on the mainland, so you can see what I'm putting together. And that's like a day to the west of John O'Groats. So they're little bits that stick out on the top and bottom of the country that make them the most southern and the most northern. So that was my start point and my end point. And then I also, I mean, the Midlands of England is quite industrial in parts. I mean, there are beautiful places too, don't get me wrong, but there's some big cities, and I thought, I'm not entirely convinced I want to navigate myself through those parts of the country. So I detoured into Wales. So after I'd done the far southwest, I went into Wales and crossed the centre of Wales to the northwest of Wales, where is Wales's highest mountain, Snowdon, before coming back into England and heading north to Scotland. So my route ended up being almost 1,400 miles, which is considerably longer than the direct route. But it was also, you know, I got to see many more of the more remote parts of the country, which is obviously beautiful and you know, better than, in my view, than walking through urban areas, which isn't particularly fun, except when you're very hungry. But
you know, one thing that I always tell people is just how beautiful the UK is for walking, and it's one of these places that really punches above its weight, and there's so much diversity. And so you were able to sample so much, from coastal paths to, you know, rural hills, Snowdonia. What are some other places you went to that are really spectacular that, you know, somebody who hasn't been there should consider this might be a fun place to go for a week-long walking holiday?
Yeah, there are so many places. The far southwest for coastal scenery is absolutely breathtaking. Inland, it's small little villages. Of course, we're famous for our pubs here. There's always a little country pub, which is somewhere nice to stop to eat. And it's, you know, we're a small, quite densely populated island, really. But it is what I always find amazing in the UK is you don't have to walk very far until you lose the people, and you do feel like you're really in the great outdoors. So, you know, in Cornwall, I started in the middle of July, which is the height of high season. It's full of people on their summer holidays with their children. And when you went into the little coves and the little towns, they're quite busy. But as soon as you walk up to the cliffs and start walking, once you've gone a mile, you're on your own. And you find the next little cove that's not accessible by car. And, you know, and you're really in the great outdoors. And you know, it's the wild southwest of the UK jutting out into the Atlantic. And so these bays and coastal views are stunning, and the water is turquoise. I mean, on a sunny day, it looks like you're in the Caribbean. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, the weather can be rough too, but that brings its own, you know, it's fabulous in my view to be, if the weather's a bit rough, you know, and you're on the wild coastal sort of place, as long as you can manage to get dry, there's something great about that too. So that's one area. Wales is there's a coastal path around the whole of Wales now, and there's this beautiful coast in Wales. But I walked through the centre of Wales, which is one of the most the least densely populated areas of the UK, alongside Scotland. So it's incredibly quiet, and you're just in these rolling hills. So that's another beautiful area too. The Lake District in the northwest of England, it's a national park, quite a small area. It's stunningly beautiful, full of lakes. It can rain quite a lot, but hence where the water comes from. But you know, when you're in an island like we are in Britain, the weather changes really quite quickly because it blows in from the Atlantic. So if you get rain, you'll get it for a couple of hours and then it blows through. So I think people think, oh, it's going to be terrible in the UK because the weather will be awful, and so I'm sure it's lovely, but I'll go somewhere where it's going to be nicer. But actually, I walked for 73 days, and I had a couple of periods of bad weather in the whole time. In fact, I battled heat more than anything else. I started and it was an absolute heat wave. in Cornwall and so hot for us. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I did get a bit wet over 73 days, but not that much. Really not that much because the weather blows through. So, and I haven't even mentioned Scotland. Scotland is the least populated part of the UK. The further north you get, the Highlands are stunning mountains. There's a huge amount of walking to be done. Wonderful scenery. So yeah, there's so many things to see.
So starting out on your walk, you mentioned, it was almost a flippant a comment, and then it started ruminating. You're like, I got to start doing this. You didn't have any of the gear. And we all think back to 2021, I had some old tents that I just put up on Facebook Marketplace. And I remember I put them up and I had like 150 messages in a couple hours because I didn't realize you couldn't buy a tent. And the only thing you could do was going camping here in the Rockies in the summer of 2020. How did you get the gear?
Well, I had some gear. So because, I've walked and hiked, day hikes before now and done bits of camping, but they weren't particularly lightweight. I mean, the rucksack, I ended up sourcing from the French Pyrenees. It was, I did searching online to find a good lightweight rucksack, found what I wanted to get, and they just didn't exist in Britain. No one had it. Everybody had bought them. And I found this ski shop in the French Pyrenees, which rather strangely, the year after when I walked across the Pyrenees, which we might talk about a bit later, I came across the shop I'd bought it from in the middle of nowhere in the French Pyrenees, which was slightly strange. But and I went in and told them actually, and they mailed it to me, and it arrived. It arrived 2 days later. I was amazed, but it took hours and hours of searching to find it. I just managed with an old tent I had, which really wasn't very light and turned out not to be very waterproof, which not 2 or 3 weeks into the walk, I desperately needed to replace a tent. The weather was pretty good early on, so it wasn't so problematic, but I knew it was probably going to get worse as I got into September and October. So, I bought an American brand tent, a lightweight tent, and it was couriered to me by the company. And I found it it was not available anywhere in the UK or even Europe I could find. And I ended up on Twitter and Instagram messaging the company and going, have you got one? And they sent me the last tent that existed in their North America shops. The last one. They found one in, I think it was Salt Lake City branch in Utah. And they said, well, if you pay us the money, we'll send it to you. And they did. And so I got it posted to me in Wales. So I met my new tent in Wales and finally had something that was waterproof. So, I don't know if, I guess lots of other people go through this too in terms of the packing challenge, where you think, I'm going to be ruthless. I'm really going to be ruthless. I'm only going to take what I really need to take because I'm walking a long way and I've got to carry all this stuff. And then you think you've been ruthless, and then you start walking, and you realize really quickly you haven't been ruthless at all. And there are all sorts of things that you thought were necessary, and actually, clearly they aren't necessary. You can survive with quite a lot less than you thought. And so it was only, I think it was on day 3 in Cornwall. It had been hot and really tough walking, because the thing about coastal walking, I mean, foolishly, I've thought this in the past, you think, a walk along the coast will be nice because it's pretty flat. Well, you're not in mountains, but the trouble is you're going down to a cove and up the other side, and then down to a cove and up the other side. And so, you can easily do 1,000 meters a day up and down constantly on a coastal walk. And so it was quite a challenging start. And so after day 4, I took a day off and just said, I'm sending stuff home. I packed stuff up. I chucked stuff away. I packed stuff up and mailed it back, and just sort of got rid of some of the weight because I was sure I wasn't going to make it if I carried on carrying whatever I was carrying at the time. Maybe 17 or 18 kilos or something, which was crazy.
There's a fun part in the book where you're walking with a large pack, and you come across another man who has, what sounds like a small day pack, and you find out he's doing a 1 week, walk along, I think, the Southwest Coast path. And, what was going through your mind then? Like, did you start to question? Because for me, it's been a long journey of, you go out, you mail the first thing back, you mail the second thing back, you come back.
Yeah.
Next trip, it's iterative.
Yeah.
What were you thinking when that happened? You're like, I've got this all wrong, or did you kind of? I always justified it. Oh, he must not have all these things that are obviously necessary, or he's taking a risk.
Yeah, I mean, it was extremely hot at that point as well, and I was labouring up yet another cliff when I saw this guy, and he was almost jogging, and I just and it's one of those moments you just think that would be so nice to have a pack that small. But then, I talked to him and he said, well, he didn't have a cooker, so he couldn't make a drink or, cook something up on his stove. And he was saying to me, oh, have you seen a shop? Because he had no food, and he needed to get some stuff to eat. And I hadn't seen a shop for some time, actually. But I started a bit like you say. I started justifying, saying, well, I wouldn't want to do this long walk. Okay, a week might be all right without a cooker and surviving on, I don't know, crackers and dried bread or something, and cereal bars and those sorts of things. But when you're doing a longer distance than that, and you're going to be out for a long time, I want to eat proper food in the evening. I want to be able to cook something up and those sorts of things. So yeah, I sort of justified it to myself, but I have honed the packing further since then, I have to say.
You talk about meals, and one thing that's really interesting is, a big part of your plan was, go for a nice meal, and, when you're in a village, go to the pub, have a nice pub dinner.
Yeah.
That wasn't happening. A lot of times either they weren't serving food, or, they had a city and it was all booked up. What was going on that made it so hard just to get a meal?
Well, I mean, there were two things really. One was COVID, and so as things came back to life after COVID, people were struggling for staff. But it was hugely compounded here because we left the European Union, and that meant people from other European countries couldn't come to the UK to work, and things like our hospitality sector and our care sector and all those sorts of slightly lower paid, inconvenient hour jobs that Brits don't want to work, a bit like from my time in the US, that Americans don't want to do either, are done by people who immigrants who come to the country. And we'd made it harder by doing Brexit, and so people were struggling. And sort of pubs and cafes and stuff were sort of tearing their hair out, and campsites and places, because they said, we can't open at full capacity. So this is our moment where everybody's stuck in the UK on staycations because nobody could travel abroad. So in many ways, this was a great time to have a local British business. And yet they couldn't staff themselves enough to take advantage of what was happening. And so, pubs would only have one serving a day, and that would be lunch, and I'd get there in the late afternoon thinking I'm going to have some nice food, and couldn't. So it was a bit frustrating, to be honest. I went several days and without having, it's fine, you can eat other things, but when you've done a long walk, it'd be really nice to sit somewhere and have a good meal, but it wasn't always possible, as you said.
Is that still an issue? You did your walk in 2021. If someone were to come in 2023, are there still, staffing issues?
It's much better, to be honest. It's much better than it was. That was the real sort of, if you like, the sort of crisis point post-COVID and the early days of Brexit being implemented. So the hospitality sector in particular has got much better at staffing themselves. There are still shortages in other sectors, but if you came here on holiday, I don't think you'd notice now, to be honest. Everything's open. People have got more creative at how they do things as well, because they've had to. But yeah, there are shortages in other sectors, but not that would affect visitors to the UK, I don't think.
One of the questions people always want to know is, where do you sleep on these big journeys? And you slept in a few different places. Do you want to maybe just share the options and how you decided where to sleep each night?
Yeah. So I camped. So it was 73 days, 60 something nights I was in a tent. And some of that was wild camping in the more remote places. But one of the great things about walking in the UK is, because we're quite heavily populated compared to the likes of North America, is that villages are quite close together, and they may be tiny, but they exist. And so, I think if you do something like the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail and long distance walks in Canada, you can go for days and you're just in the wilderness. It's less like that in the UK, which, if you're looking for wilderness, you find less of it here than in some other places. But it does mean that you can walk and be in the middle of nowhere and on your own. And at the end of the day, you can find a tiny village with a pub or a shop and to resupply. So I didn't have many occasions, probably only 3 or 4 across the whole walk, where I had, 2 or 3 days where I wasn't somewhere during the day or at the end of the day where you could resupply. And, particularly toward, later in my walk when you're into the autumn, it was great to be able to set up camp, and then I might have to walk another mile or 2 at the end of a long day of walk, but I'd be without my backpack, and then you'd get a good meal at the end of the day as well, which was great, and be warm.
One part of the book early on really talks about your struggles with blisters, and I think we've all been there. I think everybody's first walk, at one point you mentioned the blisters on the sole of your foot. I remember getting them like right on the instep. And how did you eventually deal with them? Did you find something that worked?
Well, in many ways, I only have myself to blame for the blisters. When you decide to do a long distance walk at 3 weeks, 4 weeks notice, and go and buy yourself a new pair of leather walking boots and thinking, well, I'll break them in along the way. Turns out that's not particularly sensible. And it was also ridiculously hot at the beginning as well, unusually hot for Britain, which I think, compounded the problem. So, as I say, I really only had myself to blame, but I bought loads of blister plasters. I mean, I think I was keeping the business going at one point, because I was, and when it's hot, these blister plasters, they do sort of reduce the pain, but they move around when your feet get hot, so they don't really stay on the blisters, and that's even worse because you get to the end of the day and you've got to do something, and maybe I shouldn't talk in too much detail about this, but it's pretty unpleasant. So yeah, it was about 2 weeks in, I think it was the worst. I mean, I was in serious pain walking, and I actually, that's the only thing on the whole walk that I thought might stop me. And I was so annoyed with myself because, of course, as I said, it really had no one else but myself to blame for it. If that was what was going to stop me from completing the walk, it would have been quite annoying. But your feet harden over time. So, things you go through, if you get blisters, you go through that awful, painful period, but then your feet get more resilient. But also I took to taping up the places that might rub. And in fact, slightly obsessively so. After I'd had blisters, I taped almost every part of my foot that might rub for weeks and weeks. Which I probably didn't need to do. And subsequent walks, you realise that you only need to do that for a few days, and then your feet are hard enough to manage. But so it was a combination of blister plasters. I'd read somewhere that it's really not a good thing to pop blisters because they can get infected, and I didn't. But actually, I think ultimately that made it worse, made it more painful. And eventually, some of them either popped on their own, or I did a little piece of minor surgery in various places because it was just getting too awful. And then you just had to try and keep as clean as you could. So it was fine in the end. And in a way, it's only blisters. I hadn't broken anything, but it's surprising if your feet are really sore, how you can think of nothing else. I mean, nothing else. I tried all sorts. I was listening to music. I was, trying to sing to myself. I was, whatever I could to try and distract myself from my feet, but it doesn't really work. It really doesn't.
The subtitle of your book references healing, and I'm interested how this walk was healing for you.
I think, as I said at the beginning, a lot had changed in my life before I went on this walk. I'd sort of given up my career, diplomatic career. I'd ended up being helping to care for my dad during COVID. So that's quite a lot of change to process. And, and I was at that point where I thought, well, I now need to decide what I'm going to do next. And so this would be the opportunity to have the headspace and the time to myself. So, I thought I may have some great thoughts along the way. I really did. I thought, those lightning bolt moments. And, I had a few of those, but largely, I think, I was wrong to expect something like that to happen. But what did happen that I really didn't expect is just the amazing power of just doing something quite simple every day. So all I had to do was get up, pack up, and walk and get to my next destination and do the reverse. Unpack, put my tent up, find some food, and that was it. And all the day you're in the outdoors and you're going at a slower pace than life normally takes you. And you just have time to sort of just really slow down in a sort of, and I mean in terms of the brain as well, instead of constantly thinking about what have I got to do, where have I got to be, what deadline have I got, what have I forgotten to do, you just get into a rhythm which is incredibly therapeutic. And it's almost meditative in a way. And I'm not one of those people who's into meditation and not it's just not my thing. I've never done that sort of thing before, but walking is almost that process. And it just and actually it's why I mentioned the sort of, I thought I'd have great thoughts. That to me is not the power of walking. The power of walking is actually just freeing the mind to just exist and allow you to exist and notice things around you that you don't notice in normal life because you're more aware and you have the time and you're calm. And so, you asked me earlier about the sort of what were the highlights of what are the beautiful places you saw along the way, and there are lots of them. We've talked about them, but the other revelation is, even in parts of the country where you think, oh, this is going to be the boring bit, this is the bit where I've got to get through the northwest, which is, you're between Liverpool and Manchester, two big cities, it's quite flat. It's not going to be very interesting. But even in the places you think aren't the most inspiring physically or, the most beautiful, there is beauty everywhere. There really is. When you have slowed down to the point that you notice it. And we don't notice it in normal life because we're whizzing about and rushing about, or you're driving past something in a car. But when you're walking through somewhere, you have time to see those things and feel those things that you don't in normal life. And so that to me was the incredible healing power of walking. It's not some great revelation, lightning bolt moment. It's actually just that slowing down and being more aware and having time for yourself. And that was a revelation, I think.
It's the way you describe that is exactly, my own experience. And then what I love about walking is, or even bike touring, it's just so simple. You have nothing to do. And what I find is, sometimes, even when I'm out with my family, we'll spend an hour or two and no one will talk. And I'll just realize in my mind, I'll have been counting to 100 again and again and again. And my mind will be completely blank. And we had an author on last year who did a bunch of, basically the book brought together a bunch of research. And they said, actually, walking is very similar to meditating. The only difference is in meditation, you do it for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But if you go on a walk by yourself, you might do a 3 or 4 hour meditation, which is unheard of. And I always wondered, after all these walks, I just feel great. And you can't explain. People say, but you must be tired and sweaty and stinky. And it's like, I don't know what it is, but within 15 minutes and a beer or a soda or a candy bar or whatever, a meal, I feel like $1 million. And I know it's not logical, but there's something about being outdoors and being active, and it just makes the body feel so good.
Yeah. I'm somewhat off asked the question of like, well, how did you do it? I couldn't do something like that. And my answer is always, you really can. I mean, okay, so I'm relatively fit, but I'm not a fitness fanatic. I'm not somebody who goes to the gym several times a week. I'm not somebody who is, running up and down mountains every day. I can. I have a decent level of fitness, and I like the outdoors. And at 3 weeks' notice, I went and walked across the country. That's not because I'm a superhero or I'm just very normal. It's totally doable. Now, if you said go and row across the Atlantic, I'd think I might need a bit of practice, a bit of training for that, or practice. But walking, everybody can do. Absolutely everybody can do, even with a backpack. Or pretty much everybody. Obviously, it's not accessible to everybody, but the vast majority of us can just do it. And it's amazing how quickly you become more and more conditioned. The beginning of the walk was quite hard. As I said, coastal walking is tough, and it was hot, and you're carrying a pack. But you just walk a fewer miles every day, and then you find within a space of 2 or 3 weeks that actually it's fine and normal, and before you know it, you're walking much further than you've ever walked before. Just because if you walk at let's say 2 or 3 miles an hour, if you're walking for 7 or 8 hours a day, you're quickly adding up the miles, and and it's totally doable. I just hope more people just get out there and start doing it, because the healing is such a bit of a loaded word, but the sort of the powers of walking just to sort of for well-being and mental health and all that sort of stuff is incredible. And I don't think I realised it before I walked the country.
And that leads me on, since this walk, you've become a bit of a nomad. You mentioned some of the other walks you've done, but what transpired in your life after the walk in terms of, you haven't gone back to the diplomatic service, so how did it impact you that way?
Well, I wrote a book about the walk across the UK. It inspired me to write, and so that was published late last year, which has been an amazing experience, and so that's what I focused on since. But I've also done some more walking. So part of my motivation walking has been raising money, and so my walk across the UK, I raised money for Alzheimer's research, given my dad's condition, and raised more than £30,000. And I've done 2 subsequent walks across. So I walked from Biarritz to Barcelona, which is the southwest of France, down to the northeast coast of Spain. But I crossed the whole of the Pyrenees on the way. The French have long distance walks called Grande Randonnée, the GRs. So that was the GR10, and you sort of climb the equivalent of Everest 6 or 7 times in the process. So I did that in, that's 2022 now. And in last year, I did a slightly shorter walk. It was about 700 and something miles. I walked from basically the eastern border of France, from the northeast near Strasbourg, and then joined the GR5, which crosses the Alps to the Mediterranean. So that was close to 800 miles, those 2 walks each, and raised another whatever it was. So in total, I've raised 45,000 don't know what that is in Canadian dollars. Sorry, 80 or 90,000 Canadian dollars, something like that, possibly. Maybe no, not that much. But
in the old days it was, but the pound has gone down from 2.4. You know, when I used to live there, down I think it's 165 now. So England's gotten a lot cheaper for me as a Canadian. It's funny you talk about raising money, and one thing that's really interesting in the book is how many people you interact with who are impacted. And, you know, there's the Moroccan barber who gives you a free haircut, and campsite owners that give you a free campsite, and people that pledge money. And even myself, you know, I hadn't really thought of it. I know two people. In fact, one of my neighbors had early onset Alzheimer's. And so I saw in a period of, you know, kind of 12 months, you know, a really significant impact. And it is, I feel like it's a disease that is pervasive. It impacts, you know, almost everybody, you know, through their network. But it's also one that we don't ever talk about. It's like this forgotten one. And what have you learned about Alzheimer's since you've been raising money and dealing with this with your father?
Well, I mean, Alzheimer's, dementia, I mean, it's a horrible, cruel disease because it basically takes away who people are and their ability to function over a period of time. My dad has now, late last year, he went into care because he can't, you know, my mum couldn't manage anymore, and, you know, he needs more support than she can provide. And, you know, they've been married so almost 60 years. And, you know, when you've been together with somebody for that long, for them to, you know, no longer be living together, it's really, really tough. But, you know, there's lots of people getting Alzheimer's much earlier as well. It's not just a disease of the very elderly. And I think, in my view, I think that's one of the reasons why less attention has been paid to Alzheimer's than to other diseases like cancer or heart disease, is because, you know, more elderly people suffer from it than younger people. And so I guess there's an assumption that it's just part of aging, but it isn't. It's a disease. I mean, you know, there are people who age, and as people get older, you know, they do suffer from various things, and, you know, they may not be able to walk as far, or they may have some physical symptoms. We all die of something at some point, but Alzheimer's is a disease, and it basically destroys the brain. And you know, it's probably, in my dad's case, it's, you know, it's taken away 10 plus years of functioning life. He's only now in his early 80s. He was diagnosed in his mid 70s. You know, people can live, you know, a high performing life until well into their late 80s or 90s now sometimes. So, you know, it does have a massive impact on people. But there's this, as I say, there's an assumption that it's old people and that's what happens. So actually, you know, trying to raise money for Alzheimer's research to which is hugely needed, and breakthroughs are being made, and so, you know, we will find better treatments and ultimately a cure. It will take some time, but you know, I know from sort of close family experience of this, it's not anything we want to get. I mean, you really do not want dementia or Alzheimer's if you can avoid it, and so the more we can do to sort of improve treatments, the better, because it's, you know, it's affecting millions and millions of people around the world now, and has a massive impact on society, from everything from the care sector to, you know, people who like my parents, who can no longer live together and won't see out the rest of their life together because of this disease. So, yeah, the more we can do, the better, basically.
And with that, I want to say thank you for coming on the show today, Patrick. It's been great to hear about the walk, but I think what makes it special is also giving light onto the impact of Alzheimer's and being able to tell your story a little bit. If people want to follow along, find your book, how do they do that?
Well, they can. I post daily photos of all my walks on Instagram, which is at Patrick J Davies. So they'll find me on Instagram, and on Instagram in my bio you'll find a link to the book and lots of other things. So if anybody wants to go there, they can find it there. And I have a website which is patrickjdavies.com, so they can go there as well.
Excellent. And once again, Patrick, thanks for coming on the show. And it's a really fun read. It's very heartfelt at times. And for someone who's always wanted to do the route, it's kind of fun to read a great story about that's informative, that makes me think, oh, how would I do that? So I urge everyone, if you're looking for a read here for a cold winter weekend, go get the Kindle book. You can have it in your hands in 15 seconds.
Thanks very much.
And with that, thank you, everyone, for sticking around for this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.